Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Hope you can hear me. Microphone's a bit short. My name is Richard Fisher. I'm the Chief Communications Officer of the Development and Alumni Division at UBC. And I would like to start off by welcoming everyone, first of all, and secondly, acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral and ceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. What you're about to experience tonight is one of the many ways we engage with our alumni. When it comes to the things that motivate alumni to stay connected with UBC, we listened and we curated our programs to target them. So, have a look at this other video.
What motivates alumni to stay connected with UBC? We ask them, and it comes down to lifelong enrichment. Here are some of the ways we fulfill that. Interested in landing a new job or accelerating your professional growth? Your next step is a careers program for both new grads and mid-career professionals. Alumni UBC helps with personal growth too, with things like the A card. It's free for UBC alumni, and it includes access to over 4,000 online journals. Our award-winning Trek magazine is another way to learn, as is our digital library of webcasts, podcasts, and events, such as our UBC Dialogues series. And for those who like to explore the globe, there's the Alumni UBC Travel Club, with trips to destinations guided by UBC experts. Whether or not you're traveling with us, be sure to bring your Alumni UBC BMO MasterCard, because wherever you are, you can show your UBC pride and reward yourself too. And when in Vancouver, be sure to visit the Robert H. Lee Alumni Center, the home of UBC Alumni for Life, in the heart of the Point Grey campus. It's a place for connection, celebration, and collaboration. More than 1,000 alumni and other friends of UBC dug deep to make it a reality. Now thousands more can benefit. Alumni contribute in other ways too, by volunteering, becoming admission readers, or serving on committees. So how valuable is all of this? Well, over 50,000 of our graduates from Vancouver and the Okanagan engage with UBC every year, and the numbers are growing. So it pays to stay in touch with Alumni UBC, because after all, it's yours.
Okay, so that's the, you've seen two commercials for the Alumni Centre so far, and I say so far, there's still time. The Alumni Centre, as you probably know, is named after Bob Lee, one of our most engaged alumni, and it's the first freestanding, purpose-built alumni centre of its kind in the Western world, as far as we know. So I'm caging it there. So, but it is a symbol of the partnership between UBC and its alumni. We invite all of our 320,000 alumni to visit, not all at once, obviously, it's not that big. But please feel free to come back to the Alumni Centre anytime. It really is your home at UBC. Now, in the past year, it's been a very busy year. We've successfully concluded our Start an Evolution campaign, which engaged about 100,000 individual alumni over the life of the campaign, and raised about 1.6 billion for research, student learning, and community initiatives. We officially opened the Robert H. Lee Alumni Centre in September as a kind of a landmark legacy of the campaign. And in the June 2016, we concluded UBC's centennial at the Alumni Centre, marking our first 100 years since the first graduating class. So that's the story. Now, last but certainly not least, if any of you have Twitter accounts, you may have noticed a certain increase in activity in the last 3 months. Last month, when our President Santarono joined us as the 15th President and Vice Chancellor of UBC. He joins us from the University of Cincinnati in Ohio, where he served as President from 2012 to 2016. His father was actually a UBC prof in mathematics and in the early 60s, and we are delighted to welcome him back to Vancouver. I just want to acknowledge while I'm here, our partnerships with the UBC Sustainability Office and the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight as part of our UBC Dialogue series Can developing nations lead the movement towards climate solutions? We are so happy that all of you carved out time from your schedules to join us here at the Telus Garden. And by the way, if anyone hasn't been up to the 25th floor, it's pretty amazing. Day around. Impressive. It's going to be huge. Fantastic. It's a beautiful 25th floor. We would also like to thank our presenting sponsor, Scotiabank, and our media and broadcast sponsor, CBC, for their ongoing support of these important discussions. And of course, a special thanks to our webcast partner, the Irving K. Barber Learning Centre at UBC. The webcast of this event will be available on the website shortly after. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our partners and sponsors for their tremendous support. Now, this bit involves technology, so it's quite likely to go wrong. Okay. Usually at this point, we'd encourage you to turn off your cell phones, but we want you to turn them to silent and leave them on. But put them on silent. If you're into Twitter, you can tweet the event at Alumni UBC, at Pix Canada, and the hashtag is hashtag UBC Dialogues, all one word. So feel free to tweet to your heart's content. We are also going to use a new technology tonight, which is an audience engagement platform, which we are going to use to involve the audience at certain questions at certain points in the evening. So if you have a mobile device, a smartphone, tablet, laptop, please take 30 seconds now to take it out and go to the URL that you should be seeing on your screen, yes, alumniubc.cnf.io. The URL is going up there, and if you need to access free wireless, it's because we're in the Telus building, it's free. And it's the network you should be looking for is just Telus. Nothing else, not Telus Public, not Telus anything else, just Telus. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then we're going to try an experiment question. This tool allows us to ask questions and to comment in real time through the discussion. And other attendees can like your question, and when we get to the Q&A portion of the evening, our moderator will pose the questions from this audience to the panel. So, it's not an instant replay thing. You give us your questions. We'll come to them at the end of the main discussion. So that's the URL. For a trial run, I just want to give you one question and try your technology, make sure it's working. And the question is, do you think we are doing enough in Canada to work towards a solution for climate change? Is that up there? Do you see the question? Yeah, okay. So I think I can guess the answer to this one, but so answer it now, and as you answer, the projections will go up on the screen, giving you the actual results. So there you go. That's just the way it works, and as you can see there, it's a pretty clear answer. And throughout the evening, we'll be able to source those answers at the same time as we go through the Q&A session. So, why UBC Dialogues? Basically, our alumni have told us that they want to get involved with the university and with our academic partners, our academic professors, to talk about the issues that matter to them, and of course this is a very high priority to many. The conversation, as I mentioned, will be podcast and videotaped and available on the alumni website in a couple of days. On behalf of UBC, I want to thank our speakers in advance for their time, but mostly for their expertise, because you've got them for 45 minutes, it could be 45 years of experience you're talking to. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Scotiabank's Jennifer Patterson, who happens to be a BA in anthropology, which I'm reliably informed is an excellent training for banking. And she's the manager of personal banking from Scotiabank from the Vancouver main branch, which is over there. And she'll provide some brief remarks to introduce our presenting sponsor and our tonight's moderator. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Richard, and good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here tonight to welcome you all to UBC Dialogues. Scotiabank is committed to supporting the communities in which we live and work. And like UBC Dialogues, we believe that different ideas and perspectives contribute to a strong and a healthy society, one that fosters an inclusive culture and celebrates talent and diversity. And so we're proud to be partnering with our friends at Alumni UBC at this fantastic series of events. Tonight we're in for a real treat, as we'll hear from another outstanding lineup of panelists. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our moderator for the evening. Lisa Johnson is a digital journalist based in Vancouver, Canada with CBC News, where she's worked for 10 years in radio, television, and the web. Her specialty is science and environment stories, from E. coli and isotopes to carbon offsets and killer whales. As a general assignment news reporter, Lisa has also covered kidnappings, earthquakes, and won an RT-DNA award for live reports from the Stanley Cup riot. Before journalism, Lisa was interested in science. She graduated from UBC with an honors degree in biology after pipetting, stickleback DNA, I hope I got that right, counting kelp, and watching fish mating dances. She then returned to UBC for her master's in journalism, focusing on science and risk communications. To guide us along in tonight's dialogue, please join me in a warm welcome to our moderator, Lisa Johnson.
Thank you very much. So glad to be here tonight. So this is my third UBC dialogue in recent years. One of them was on earthquakes, and the big one in Vancouver, preparing for that. So that was a little bit frightening. Then there was one on quantum computing, which was also frightening to prepare for me, because it was like string theory and qubits, I don't know. But it was more hopeful. And this one will hopefully be a bit of a mix of hope and the very real concern about confronting the challenge of climate change. So at the climate talks in Paris last December, 195 countries agreed to reduce their carbon emissions and limit global climate change. The agreement was ambitious, but also recognized that less developed countries would need more time to begin reducing their emissions. Now, you can argue, and people do, that it isn't fair to hold developing countries to the same standards as societies that have made a lot of money and grown wealthy with carbon-driven industry. It's also clear that developing nations can't afford to ignore the challenge of climate change, because some of those countries are the most vulnerable on the planet when it comes to rising sea level and other problems. So these are some of the issues we're going to be looking at tonight. What are the structural changes that need to be made so less developed countries can combat climate change as equal partners? And sort of what does equal mean? Are there technologies that could be used to leapfrog sort of our carbon past and not replicate it in other parts of the globe? Could that work? Can we take some hope there? And we have four fabulous panelists that I'm going to invite up to the stage who are going to share their perspectives on this question. And you guys can come up now. I'll introduce you as everyone's getting settled. So first on the stage is Simon Donner. He's an associate professor of climatology at UBC, and he works at the intersection of climate science, marine science, and public policy, including the impact on coral reefs. And one of the places he does work is one of those island nations that's so vulnerable. Welcome, Simon. Sybil Seitzinger is a professor in the School of Environmental Studies at UVic and executive director of the Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions, which brings together research minds from 4 BC universities to focus on problems and solutions of climate change. Her research is centered on nutrient biogeochemistry in marine and freshwater ecosystems, ranging from the molecular to the global scale, and looking a lot at the human impacts on those systems. Martine Autran is an assistant professor at UBC in planning and the co-director of the Master of Engineering Leadership in Urban Systems, which is a program delivered with civil engineering. His work tackles challenges in energy and sustainability with a focus on cities and climate change. Welcome, Martino. And Samit Gulati is an associate professor in environmental and resource economics at UBC, studying the economics of urban transportation, the effectiveness of carbon taxes, a very hotly debated topic here in BC, and the cost effectiveness of programs working on energy efficiency. So please give all of our panelists a warm welcome. So just before we get rolling with the discussion up here, a little bit of formatting. We're going to be talking amongst ourselves for asking questions for about 30 minutes, and then going to turn it over to you. So hopefully you will be thinking, remember that engagement platform that you were shown? So thinking and even typing in questions as they come to you. You can see other people's questions and vote them up. After some of the discussion up here, I'll turn to there. Some of the most popular questions, I'll bring them up on stage, and then for people who didn't bring a smartphone to this discussion, we'll also have a chance for maybe 1 or 2 questions just over the mic at the end as well. And just as a reminder, we are recording this. The evening's dialogue will be made available on Alumni UBC's digital library. So everyone needs to know that. All right. Simon, you are in the hot seat next to me. It means you get to talk first. With your opening thoughts on our big question, can developing nations lead the movement toward climate solutions?
I think definitely they're going to be a big part of the solution. They have to be. But part of what doesn't get enough attention is the effort that's going to be necessary to help the developing world adapt to climate change, right? They're not as responsible for the problem, and they're being more affected by it largely than the developed world. And I can tell you a story a little bit from the Pacific Islands. About 15 years ago, the World Bank, big funder of international aid projects, dams, all sorts of developments, decided that it wanted to get into climate change because it saw it as the next big thing in development. It was a good prediction. And so a bunch of people at the World Bank spun the globe, and that is an actual quote from one of the consultants involved, spun the globe and tried to find the most vulnerable place they could to do a demonstration project. They'd give the country money and they'd try to see, look, we can fund climate change adaptation. That country was in the central equatorial Pacific. It's called Kiribati, and it's where I've actually been doing field work for the past decade. It's a bit of a fluke. I do research there as a climate scientist because I'm studying what happens to low-lying islands as the sea level's rising and what happens as the ocean's warming. But also, it turns out it's been this demonstration project for how can the big institutions of the developed world help the developing world adapt to climate change. And I'll talk about it a bit later in the evening, but really one of the big take-homes for me after about a decade is that adaptation is doable, but it is one long, hard, expensive slog. And the problem is a lot of what we try to do when we interact with the developing world is try to do one-off projects that make us look good, right? So we'll give money for a year, give money for 2 years or whatever, and try to build something figuratively or maybe literally concrete. But often what the countries need is just more consistent long-term funding, and how that financing is going to come about is one of the big questions for climate policy internationally.
All right. So we're going to be picking up a bunch of those threads later. But next, Sybil, what do you have to say about this big question? Can developing nations lead?
I think developing nations can certainly show leadership and inspire the developed world as well to step up their game. I think when we look at what happened just before the Paris Agreement, where China and the U.S. came forward together to announce their plans for reducing emissions, I think that showed leadership. It also provided inspirations for other countries coming forward. I think one thing, though, that we need to keep in mind is that in many developing countries, it's not climate change that's the most important thing on their agenda at the moment. And in my previous job, I worked in countries all over the world, in Africa, in South America, in Asia, many developing countries. And I often was talking with the leaders of their environment ministry or their other ministries that dealt with the environment, maybe forestry, etc. And I would often ask them, what is the most important thing on your agenda? And often, it was not, in fact, I think never did they come forward with having climate change be the top. It was usually energy security, food security, water security, national security. And so I think that's one thing that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about leadership, adapting to the changing climate, as well as decreasing emissions. We have to we have to listen and understand what the issues are in these countries and how we can help them see where addressing climate can go hand in hand with the development or the addressing of issues that are the top on their agenda.
Martino, you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I like to take a look at the data and in terms of the context that we're in. So this also relates to a lot of my research that's focused on cities. But I think it's worthwhile to reflect on the fact that for the first time in history, we have more people living in cities than in rural areas throughout the world. So currently, that's around a little bit over 3 billion. By the middle of the century, we're talking around 6 billion people in urban areas, in centers. And if one looks at the trends right now, where the population is happening, where the urbanization is happening, this is in emerging economies and developing countries. And so the story there is that the impacts will be felt the greatest in these areas. So the whole point of can developing countries take a leadership role? If we look at recent trends, in fact, I would argue that they are taking a leadership role, and they will continue to take a leadership role. And this is driven by necessity in terms of, as Sybil points out, not necessarily climate change, but dealing with local environmental impacts and also economic growth. So I'm quite optimistic that the trends will continue in terms of developing countries taking a leadership role. And I guess the one caveat to that is that we in the developed countries need to also step up to play much more strongly than we have.
Okay. Sumi?
So, as you mentioned, I study environmental policy, and previously I also studied the politics of environmental policy. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is sort of my thoughts on the politics of leadership of climate change from the developing world. And before I start, I guess I want you guys to think like you would think if you were in India. And so I want you to picture yourself in a slum in Bombay. And I'm borrowing from Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forever, so I'll be reading some of that. But this slum is near, sort of, it's like a mix of India's worst and best in Bombay. It's in the middle of 5 luxury hotels, and it's near Bombay's International Airport. And in the middle of the slum, which people coexist with, a lot of people in the slum coexist with, there's a sewage lake. And I'm going to read a little description of the sewage lake. So late at night, the contractors modernizing the airport dumped things in the lake. Annavadis, which are Annavadis, the slum, also dumped things there. Most recently, the decomposing carcasses of 12 goats. Whatever was in that soup, the pigs and dogs that slept in its shallows emerged with bellies stained blue. Some creatures survived the lake, though not only the malarial mosquitoes. As the morning went on, a fisherman waded through the water, one hand pushing aside cigarette packs and blue plastic bags, the other hand dimpling the surface with a net. He would take his catch to the Marol market to be ground into fish oil, a health product for which demand had surged now that it was valued in the West. Now, this is a slum which, I mean, you might think is filled with people who are really poor. It's not. No one in that slum, almost no one in that slum qualifies as poor by Indian standards. These people are actually a success story for a lot of the people for a lot of the villages that they left behind. And when I go back to India, and I go back often, and I often go back in the winter, and I always descend in the middle of the night through India's, especially North India's, infamous haze. It's got particulate matter concentrations that are higher than almost anywhere in the world, even Beijing. So you hear about Beijing, and India is really what it is. So India is blanketed in polluted air. It's flooded in polluted water, and I'm not exaggerating. And so you look at a country like that, and its politicians aren't making environmental gains a priority, even though fixing those very simple sort of sewage-filled water supply and its very high concentrations of particulate matter could save lots of lives, could make a whole lot of people much healthier. It's not a priority. So given that, I sort of feel like if we expect India's political system to take a leadership in climate change, it's maybe delusional.
So we have some hope, some delusion, some sewage lakes up here. I want to, we're obviously going to be moving past, international agreement type of leadership in this discussion, but because the Paris Agreement has been mentioned, I want to touch on this. And it is, as someone in the media, a lot of times those agreements, those those meetings get talked about with sort of this us and them mentality in the public from the developing and developed nations. Well, if they're not going to do something, why should we? If we're not going to do something, why should they? This sort of a thing. To what extent did Paris move the world's nations beyond that sort of stalemate that had been happening?
Well, I think that one of the things to think about is if you go back to the Kyoto Agreement, right? And even you go back to the Conference of the Parties, the COP15, which was in Copenhagen in 2009, right? It was still talking about how the developed world could decrease emissions, you know? And it was the developed world that we were focusing on and that was really came under the Kyoto Protocol. But I think in Paris, there was a huge movement forward in looking at the world as a whole and looking at not only the current emissions from developed countries, but also the increasing emissions from developing countries or countries in economic transition, and looking forward in time. And I think it's sort of the long-term perspective is coming in here. If you think about, 50 years ago, where if you look about what the emissions were from, let's say, China and India and Brazil and other countries, we wouldn't have even thought about them as being large emitters 50 years in the future. And I think we have to keep that in mind now, is thinking about it's not just the countries that are large emitters now, but who's going to potentially be a large emitter in the future as their economies grow if we don't take this seriously now and help them to develop in a way that has low emitting energy systems, industrialization, and other processes.
What form, though, should that help take to have it work? I mean, Simon, you were mentioning that it is the types of projects that people like funding may not be the types of projects that need to be done.
No, and that is one of the problems. Now, the example I was giving was with respect to adaptation, but it's a bit of an issue in general. So the Paris Agreement there were a number of important breakthroughs just in diplomacy, right? As Sybil mentioned, one of them, which is at Paris, you had every country in advance of Paris agreeing to here's what we're going to do to address climate change. So every country in the world, that participated in Paris, all 195, submitted some plan to do something about their emissions. And in some cases, it wasn't an instant reduction. It was saying, in the case of China, here's the year in which our emissions are going to stop increasing. But that was an accomplishment, right? So that was good. A place where there's still a division, but a division on purpose, is the idea of how the developing world is going to get financial help to do with climate change. And so the other big promise in these international agreements is not just reducing emissions, it's how much money is going to be offered. And so the offer right now is that the developed world is supposed to be providing $100 billion per year by the year 2020 in the sort of quote-unquote climate aid. It's not clear what that means, like whether it's only loans, is it grants, is it private financing. So that's all sort of being debated. And so it's one area where there's still a little bit of confusion is, who exactly are the donors, who exactly are the recipients. We know that Canada, for example, is a donor, but is South Africa? Are they a donor or a recipient? Because they're sort of a middle-income country, so that's a little bit complicated. And the other thing is that it's nice to set these international goals. It's a great start, but how do we go from there to the type of project-level consistent funding? It's one thing to say we want the total number to be something by a given year, but how do we ensure that we're not just funding, individual organizations funding a new seawall in some small Pacific Island country, but making sure they're funding a decade-long training program to manage that seawall. And that's really the challenge.
I think another thing too, Simon, is that I think we need a clearer, more rigorous definition of what is a valid climate solution or a valid reduction in emissions, and what really is what is effective adaptation, right? So that the money that is being spent is used in a way that is actually has more of a chance of actually leading to a reduction in emissions or an effective adaptation or change in behavior, change in the way things are done so that people can adapt to the changing climate. I think there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and you don't want things that are money that is listed as supporting the adaptation or the decrease in emissions, the mitigation, when in fact it really isn't. So it's a complex issue, isn't it? It's a real challenge.
So, moving from these sort of big agreements to on-the-ground examples, are there already things happening in developing nations that are moving faster than we are in terms of not necessarily regulations and protocol related to these agreements, but like on the ground sustainable energy use? Is there leadership there that we should be looking at?
India has a plan to up their solar capacity to 65 by 2022, 65 gigawatts. Their installed capacity, India is complicated because you can say installed capacity, that's sort of centrally installed, but a lot of electricity is generated privately because everyone needs to. So the hotels, like I was talking about, will all be generating their own electricity because they can't trust the grid or their regular supply. So there's a whole lot, but centrally installed capacity, or at least institutionally installed capacity, about 300 gigawatts. India is already 2.5% of that is solar. And it's bigger than, we hear India trying to get a lot of nuclear energy, but this is actually already bigger than nuclear. So solar is big in India, it's increasing, and the expectation is that we in India might be actually at 100 gigawatts by 2030. So there's some leadership there. At least there's hope there, but I think that's a lot of it is because solar's become so cheap, and it's not because the government's dying to make India renewable. It's just it's a cheap source of energy.
And one of the reasons solar's become cheap too, isn't it? Because that China has made major investment in solar technology.
That's right.
So you can look at, those are sort of two economies working. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say they're working together, probably, would we? But
but
one
China has made huge strides in making solar panels, PVC cheap. Yeah.
So when you actually look at global investment in renewable energy, you see these upward trends across Europe, the US, emerging economies, China, India. When the financial crisis hit in 2007, all of those trends drop off. And the only thing that floated the renewable energy investment globally was China. Those investments continued up. Now that's of vital importance for the reasons just alluded to, because for these new technologies to take hold, they're determined by what's called technology learning curves. And this is a function between the improving performance of the technology and the mass take-up of the technology. This basically means the more people that use them, the better they get, the cheaper they get. And so this is of vital importance. Solar panels have dropped in the last 6 years by 80%. Wind has dropped by 50% in the last 7 years. And these cost reductions will continue. And as these populations in emerging economies continue to take up these technologies, we will have a market competitor for fossil-based systems.
So are you actually hopeful? Like I think of the example that Al Gore likes to give, and he gave at the TED Talks this year in Vancouver about the opportunity to leapfrog sort of the carbon development that happened here and not replicated in other parts of the world, but to like how in places in Africa, people went from having no phones, didn't get landlines, went straight to mobile technology because it was more useful and possible at that point. Do you see that happening, or is it still going to be coal and these sort of very predictable, cheap energy sources for now? Where is that tipping point going to be?
So that's absolutely right. The problem, of course, with renewable energy is that it's intermittent. That means you can't turn it on and you can't turn it off when you want. So right now, coal and fossil-based sources will always, well, right now they are part of the solution, as it were. That's why we need a lot more research in certain unproven technologies. For example, carbon capture and storage, which is basically where you can take the carbon from the point of the production of the energy and stuff it into the ground. That potentially has some opportunity there to deal with the transition into more renewable energies. In terms of the tipping point, right now, the jury is still out. Right now, for example, in cities, when we come back to the story of cities, a lot of the emissions are being generated in cities, and this is going to require a massive amount of investment in green infrastructure, low carbon energy, but those decisions, we're still waiting to see what's going to happen.
I want to jump in here saying just about the leapfrogging. One of the things I want to go back to is India is not, a country like India is not prioritizing leapfrogging. It's prioritizing doing electrification getting electricity to its people, who most of them don't have electricity. It's prioritizing growth in just the more traditional sense, right? And so if coal is being shunned by the developed world and that's making coal prices fall further, expect developing countries to take it up. Expect them to say, okay, coal's cheap, I can build a plant that will run cheaper. Expect them to take it up. And there's a sort of, I guess, a researcher I follow in India. His name's Samir Saran, and he's been making these arguments for a long time about how, despite coal being a dirty fuel, countries like India have a very small proportion of their total energy needs coming from coal, even relative to developed countries at this point. And he believes that this can be expanded without them being worse than developed countries at some point. And he argues that for every coal plant put up in India, someone should be shutting down a coal plant in the developed world. And that's sort of how this trade should be done, but there should be no restrictions. And he always argues against, he seems to be angry at the World Bank because the World Bank has stopped funding coal projects in the developing countries. And he thinks that's inappropriate because it's not fair and it's not the priorities that the developing countries want.
For those of you who've done, and I think you all have worked in other parts of the world and seen, if not sort of firsthand impacts, sort of how the discussion happens in other parts of the world, is there anything that kind of drives you crazy about the way we talk about climate change here? Is there anything that, in sort of this, I'm thinking about sitting here in Vancouver in Canada talking about other parts of the world. It's not that we shouldn't, but is there anything that is difficult about that?
There are many things that are difficult.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been, I was personally frustrating, but something that I've given a lot of thought to over the years is that I've been fortunate to be doing research as part of my job in the Pacific Islands for a number of years, and it kind of started almost on a lark, and then I developed relationships with people, and I go back and keep working with them. And one of the things that's difficult is that I think it's definitely true, speaking of very large developing countries, obviously like India, but really true of the smaller developing countries that we hear about in the news that we expect to be very impacted by climate change, is that the conversation we have about them in this part of the world, it's well-meaning, but it's a bit dishonest in ways, in that we see headlines of flooding islands, right, in some part of the world, right? You see, a flood in Bangladesh or a Pacific Island country being hit by a high tide, and we see the video, it looks great on the news and everything. But really what we're doing is using these people as like a narrative device in our own conversation, right? So people are producing these videos and putting them out there and talking about it in the news because they're trying to convince each other here that we need to do something about climate change, right? And it's not actually really engaging with the people there. Now that's, granted, not easy to do, but it has an impact in that part of the world. And so vulnerability is something that different cultures and whatnot come to perform a little bit over time. And if a country like some of the Pacific Island countries where I work, like Kiribati, if in order to get attention from the world, they need to appear vulnerable to climate change, they will do that purposely or not, on purpose, intentionally or not. And the result is that sometimes, it's like method acting, right? If you play the part for a long time, you start to become it. And I can tell you many examples of things that have happened. Island I can think of where, when the groundwater went salty, they blamed climate change, their own groundwater pumping system that they had built. And it's because people that were once really resilient are now not as resilient because they're blaming the developed world on their problems. And some of it is the way we talk about it. Yeah.
I maybe pick up on that a little bit from a slightly different angle, is that I see from being in developing countries and talking with people, and this is not a criticism, it's just an observation, is that whenever there is an event that happens, whether it's a flood or whether it's a drought, etc., that there's a attribution of it to climate change when in fact it may not be climate change. but that then it's a way of looking for funding to help them deal with their problems. And
Well, that happens here too. I mean, you can blame the
Certainly.
media, right?
Yes, we can come back to here in many different ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's one thing that is important to keep in mind, and because it relates to understanding the multiple pressures that developing countries are under. And whether it's a large country like India, which is certainly industrial in many ways, or it's countries like Botswana, which is, I don't know if you know Botswana, it's a very arid country just north of South Africa. It was one of the only, it's only, I think, country in Africa that wasn't colonized. It's a very arid country. And their concerns are not so much with climate change right now because it's already hot there, it's already very arid. And the predictions for climate change there are not that so dire, actually. But they are facing so many issues, and one of the issues that they're facing is energy poverty. They used to get their electricity from South Africa, but now South Africa needs all of their own electricity to supply their own needs. And so they're under a very severe energy poverty situation where their electricity is on and off during the day, right? And so China is wanting to build coal plants for them, you know, because China needs to sell its coal somewhere too, you know. So it's a very complex arena out there, and I think we have to try and understand what these various countries are dealing with in their daily lives, in their political system as well in many cases, and not let that get in the way of assisting those countries with trying to come up with clean energy sources, having enough energy not just to light the lights and have energy in their homes, but so those countries can actually industrialize and really grow their economies.
I don't know, Martin or Smita, if you had thoughts on my oddly worded question, but does anything drive you crazy?
That drives me crazy. So it's for fear of us actually sabotaging this discussion and taking it somewhere else. But one of the things that drives me crazy, there's this. It's sort of an environmental theme, and it's not so much a climate theme, but it's this opposition to genetically modified food.
Oh.
And that drives me sort of nuts because I sort of think about that, and I see real solutions to genetically modified food for some developing country problems, especially food insecurity there, and this belief of what is food security versus what actually is food security for a lot of the world. Those two things drive me really insane.
Okay.
I think so a couple of points there. I think it is sometimes presented in the media and broader discussion that it's an either-or argument. Do we invest in climate change? Is that not taking money away from development, etc.? And I think this confuses the subject quite a bit, and I think Sybil touched on it, and so did Simon, in the sense that it's very true in places like sub-Saharan Africa, and in Africa in general, there's still 1.3 billion people without access to electricity. It turns out that without having access to modern forms of energy, this impacts women and children the hardest. They're the ones that are collecting firewood and stripping down the local forests. They're also the ones that are breathing in the fumes in terms of using cook stoves. So massive human development implications in terms of not having access to modern forms of electricity. The discussion sometimes goes the way of, well, why are we putting everything into climate change when we should be promoting malaria alleviation, economic development, etc.? Well, these are the people that are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So when the seas rise, all of a sudden malaria vectors increase along the coastline. Diseases spread faster. These are the very people without the financial resources to be able to equip themselves to deal with these impacts. So if you're taking care of the issue of climate change, you're also taking care of the issue of development. So these are complementary objectives, and they do not counter each other at all. The other thing that bothers me a little bit is Simon brought up the issue of a proper roadmap for after the last climate discussions in terms of where is the financing going to come from. And the expectation, of course, is that, that the developing country does provide a certain amount of financing to the developing countries. Is it any wonder that developing countries flail their arms and wave around for attention? If you look at the data, the OECD countries, by UN regulation, have already agreed to provide 0.7% of gross national income by way of overseas development assistance. 5 countries out of the OECD have lived up to that promise. So there's a lot to be skeptical about in terms of where the emerging economies are taking their stand and if they are, in fact, going to step up to plate.
So I want to start going to, you guys have been very active on the engagement platform, I guess it's called. There's a lot of questions here. I want to jump to one that just really comes off of what you're just talking about, which was asking this question of accountability, and once agreements are made, how does anyone get held to them? Asking specifically about reductions in emissions. How are countries being held accountable for the promises that they make? What is the mechanism in these international agreements?
So there'll be a review every X number of years of how countries are actually doing relative to what they committed to in what Simon referred to as their national commitments or intended reductions coming up to Paris. So there's actually, it's called stock taking. Right? Okay. And so there's actually going to be a regular review to see how countries are doing. There's no penalties for not. And in fact, after the first review, which is in 2030, no, 2020. I
think every 5 years.
Every 5 years, yeah, stock taking, yep. Countries will be asked actually to up their ambition. Because right now, the ambition level that went into Paris with countries agreeing, what the countries said they would do in terms of reducing emissions, would still get us to about a 3-degree increase in global average temperature by the end of the century. So we've got a long way to go. In fact, we need to double the reductions by then. But
a long way to go, even in terms of what people are promising?
Oh, we've got a huge way to go.
Right? Even their promises, yes. And then what they actually do about it.
But I think this is a very, very important part of the Paris Agreement is this stock taking, right? And of course, the details of how that's going to work are being worked out right now by a number of working groups. But that, I think, is going to be really key.
Okay. I just want to add to that. It's not just one of the big achievements of the Paris Agreement was as you said, stock taking was actually to get a lot of people involved and the largest sort of proportion being a part of the agreement than ever before. But I think sort of going back to the stock taking thing was to get everyone to agree on a common measurement method for carbon emissions, which was a huge sticking point before. China, I think, was the big holdout, and I think India was partly a big holdout too. They did not want to be monitored for their emissions, and finally someone sort of agreed to it. So it's not just our intentions. We can have intentions and say we achieved them, but if you're not being monitored, you can't even really go there. So there's no penalties, but we have now a system in place where it's credible.
Transparency.
Yeah, and transparency.
Some degree of transparency.
Right, some degree of transparency.
I'll just add quickly that this approach is what the Obama administration, at least internally, was calling name and shame. And so the idea that if you don't meet your target, you'll look bad internationally, and that sounds very weak, but it's easy to be critical of the fact that these aren't binding targets with penalties if you don't meet them. But an international agreement is rarely ever get something like that. To actually have an agreement where you would penalize each other's countries with taxes or something, it was never going to be realistic. And if that had happened, there was no chance the U.S. would ever ratify it. And so that was part of the reason that they pushed for the global stock taking
There's no
instead.
chance a lot of other countries.
It just wasn't realistic to everyone agree to it otherwise. So.
Interesting. I mean, I'm mindful of like the situation here in BC where the government had made like a legislated target that it's likely, I don't think anyone thinks it's going to make for 2020, right? And what will happen with that? Who knows? The top question from people in the audience in terms of voting it up is what specifically should Canada be doing? I mean, obviously we're talking about developing nations leading the way, but then Canada has a role in these discussions, would have a role, I suppose, in funding. People want to know in the audience, what should Canada be doing?
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Okay, I want to just comment on the fact that 98% of you felt Canada wasn't doing enough. But frankly, I mean, seriously, compared to the rest of the world, we have 4 fairly big provinces doing significant carbon pricing, and I think that's better than any other country I know of.
Wait a minute.
So-
No, the carbon price in Sweden, since I just lived there for the last 7 years, is $190
Right,
dollars a
but
ton
it's
compared
not,
to 30 in
it's-
BC.
No, $30 here, but it covers 70% of the economy, and Sweden doesn't.
Yeah, doesn't cover as
Right,
much.
and so
yeah.
I know, I
Yeah,
agree,
well, we can
prices
get
are
into
really high,
details,
we can get into
but,
details there,
yeah,
but I think we have
I think
a
we have
large
to-
coverage here, and I think we're doing well, but I want to go, so I want then cede to you here. I think.
So I just read in the paper this morning, actually, that the federal government has indicated that they will impose a system on provinces that don't agree to either a cap and trade agreement or a carbon tax. I think that shows leadership. I think that shows a tremendous step in the right direction. But if one looks at the targets that are in place, which is something like a 30% reduction in emissions across the economy from a 2007 baseline, I think it is, that is not enough. That is not enough. So the best studies that we have out there are suggesting an 80% at least reduction in developed countries across the board within the next 20, 25 years. And in emerging economies, we're talking about 50% reduction, with those converging over time shortly thereafter. A 30% reduction is not going to do it.
Yeah. And it was actually, by the carbon tracker, was listed as insufficient, right, or inadequate, or and I think the point that you're making too here is that in order to stay below a 2-degree global average increase is where we have to get to that 80% reduction. And in fact, to actually stay below 2 degrees by close to the end of the century, we have to get to essentially 0 emissions. So not just 80% reduction, but actually net 0 emissions. So we've got a long way to go, and it's not just the developed countries, but we have to help to ensure that developing countries, as their economies grow, can have a very low emission
Is it a pipe dream?
country.
Is 2 degrees a pipe dream?
I think it's important to be ambitious.
Okay.
1.5 degrees might be a bit of a pipe dream, but
think we're past that.
2 degrees, 1.5 degrees was in the agreement
Right.
partly out of
Right.
respect to the developing world. By putting it in there, there was science that says there are countries that are going to be severely affected by climate change with that much warming. And by the developed world agreeing to having that in there, it was basically admitting that we recognize if we don't get to 1.5 degrees, which we probably won't, that we're responsible for some of the harm that comes. And so it was important, but there's a subtext to why it was important. Yeah.
So another one of the questions being asked here on the platform and getting quite a lot of votes is, what can everyday Vancouverites do to affect change? Particularly, I'm wondering about it when you talk about a reduction of not just 30%, but 80% or net zero. This is not like the turn off the lights, recycle your cans, bike to work kind of level of change. You're talking, I imagine, more sort of structural and system level change. But the question is, what can everyday Vancouverites do about any of this? Anyone want to take that on?
If you look at our major
So I'll just draw on some of the research I just recently did with a graduate student, where we looked at emissions across different parts of Canada and different cities in Canada, and we found Vancouver ranked amongst the big cities second in overall household emissions in Canada after Montreal. And one of the reasons we found why it was so was because Montreal used hydro for all their heating, and we didn't. We used natural gas. But the other lessons we learned from there was if Vancouverites are serious about reducing emissions, they should, and we are seeing densification, they should get much more serious about densification. And I think that would be sort of the one biggest lesson, that stop saying, I mean, like I live in Dunbar, and it's sort of the bastion against densification, right? So I want someone in Dunbar to say it's fine to just build high rises. It's okay.
But I think we also have to look at short-term versus long-term situations, right? So in terms of densification, densification, why? Densification because you're reducing your transportation emissions. We can also electrify our transportation system using hydro. And so even if somebody is commuting 30 kilometers, if they have an electric car, and if our electricity source is from is from hydro electricity, then densification isn't necessarily a solution there. If you're talking about buildings, right, and look at this building that we're in, which has a fairly low footprint for carbon. I don't know the exact numbers, but I was reading some information downstairs. So I think, in the short term, we need to look at using as we have our older technologies, how to reduce our emissions. I think in the long term, though, we also need to think, once we do have essentially a zero emitting energy source, whether it's for transportation or whether it's for industry, et cetera, what kind of world do we want? How do we want to be living? Do we want to be living in a very high density environment?
So
I think with Vancouver, part of the problem is we've got a lot of people, we have a small space, we're confined by these beautiful mountains. So I think we also need to be sure that we don't confine our thoughts only to the current situation, which is a transitional situation, but also to have in mind the longer term view as well.
It kind of always comes back to real estate at some point recession in Vancouver, and give up the house dream, live in a condo.
I just have a story about hydro and power sources, and it's true. So like we found Quebec was doing really well because they used hydro for everything almost. I mean, not for transportation, but for the heating. And one of the things when I tried to understand that a little better, I learned was, I'm not exactly sure which province it was. I think it's Newfoundland, where Hydro-Quebec was buying a lot of its energy. And that was the only line that allowed Newfoundland to sort of sell its excess energy. So Hydro-Quebec got a really great deal because it was a monopoly buyer. And so then it sold its energy really cheap to within its province. But instead of using it for heating, and if Quebec used natural gas and then sent that electricity down to the northeast and displaced coal, the world would be better. So I'm skeptical about, given that we don't have enough renewable and enough zero emission sources, displacing higher emission sources in other parts of the world is better than us hogging it all.
Go ahead, sir.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, just to sort of follow on that when you think about, so what can I do as a Vancouverite? There are things obviously you can do at home, which is what we're talking about, but your actions don't always have to be directed at necessarily reducing emissions from your own house. I mean, from most of the numbers, most analyses would show, like, as an individual, if you fly less, drive less, and eat less red meat, you'll have a biggest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, the other one that could be added to that list is having fewer children, but that's kind of complicated and actually also controversial, but also depends on how you do the math. It's not everyone would agree that actually would be effective. So those are things you can do at home, right? But what Sumit sort of is getting towards is thinking about, well, what is the impact of a decision you make here outside your jurisdiction, right? And that's when thinking about, what can you do to influence your government, whether local or federal, is really important, right? Because governments are never that far ahead of the people, right? And so the more and more we try to influence regulations and change, the better the odds are we can get some of these things to happen. And one example is, okay, Canada is unlikely to meet its target for 2030, even though the target for 2030 we generally agree is not strong enough to meet the Paris Climate Agreement commitments. So what are we going to do about that? If we can't force that to happen, could we ask the country, we could decide as citizens that Canada is not going to meet its targets, we should try to help other countries do so more. We should be putting more funding into that, because that completely falls off the map in these conversations, right? We don't end up talking about, well, how much money or how much effort is Canada putting into helping the developing world respond to climate change, reducing emissions elsewhere? Maybe that should be more part of the conversation if we're failing to do it at home. So.
Go back to some of the questions here. One was actually asking about population growth, which I think kind of gets at some of the children issues. But this is going back to some of the big the big topics we were talking about at the beginning, many people have voted for the question, for countries dealing with genocide and starvation, can we really expect them to get on board with talking about emissions? But then also knowing what the world is facing, how can we not expect them to get on board? We would like to tackle that very large, as it becomes, questions of ethics, questions of fairness, questions of just reality on the ground and what's possible for anyone to take on.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is if a country is facing genocide, and it's starvation is pretty common, but if it's facing genocide, I don't expect them to be prioritizing climate change for sure. I expect them to be prioritizing something quite different, obviously. But I think the thing is, the responsibility eventually goes back to like what the panelists have already talked about. The responsibility on climate change, a lot of it lies with the developed world. And it's true, a lot of the impacts lie in the developing world. And I think I'm sort of skirting the question by saying, I think we need to do more rather than expecting them to do more when they're really suffering.
I want to give an opportunity, if there's anyone who's not all clued in on their mobiles today and wants to ask a question and hasn't been able to engage the engagement platform, there's a couple of mics in the audience. So we can open it up that way as well before we wrap up.
Hello all, thanks for the talk. My question is more long term. You say that in the Paris talks, most developed countries have already started to accept responsibility to a certain extent, that they've started to accept the responsibility of their actions causing this climate crisis. Now, when the consequences are beginning to be seen, when there's massive climate migrations and refugees are in the billions, then what responsibility do the developed countries have?
Who would like to take that?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's a fantastic question. And just to be clear, there's a lot of subtext to these things in these agreements, right? We see the major wording that comes out. Most of us don't read the full agreements. We see bits of it on the CBC News and everything. Lisa will write an article. But that's what some of this language is around, that was around 1.5 degrees, and all the subsections, the ones that don't get covered in the news, are about these sort of things. Like, are we responsible? Is the developed world responsible for quote unquote loss and damages? This is a term that is used in the agreement. So not just providing money to help you adapt to climate change, but basically to pay reparations for damage that's already happened. And so in Warsaw, the meeting in 2013, one of these UN meetings, they did agree on a declaration about loss and damages, but there was not an agreement on money. And the reason is, reasons are somewhat obvious. People don't want to promise the money up in advance, but also because it's really hard to say whether something happened as a result of climate change, right? And Sybil already talked about this earlier. A lot of things get attributed to climate change that aren't really responsible. But even in these places that are incredibly vulnerable to climate change, in the Pacific Island countries where I work, where there's nothing more than 3 meters above the ocean, and there's this one area where the road goes from about 2 to 3 meters, and everyone calls it the hill. Right, this is about as vulnerable as you can get, and you've been there for a long time when you get tired walking up it. So even there, when there's a flood and it damages a bunch of people's homes, we start saying, well, wait a minute, is that because the sea level's higher than it used to be and that high tide was higher than it used to be? Or is that because the island has 5 times as many people as it did 30 years ago, and now people are living on land that's more vulnerable that traditionally they would never have lived on? And so it's been hard to come to concrete agreements on responsibility, because it's really hard to say for sure what exactly caused something, right? And when it comes down to migration to other, why somebody migrated from one country to another, despite all the news you hear about climate migrants, there's no proven evidence that somebody moved 100% because of climate change, and it makes these agreements tough. Yeah. So it's kind of a vexing problem.
Do we have any other questions from out there? This one.
Is this on? Oh. Okay, yeah, sorry. Hi, my question is, when we were talking about what can we do as Vancouverites, and a lot of times what I'm thinking is even if we reduce our emission to 0, if you think globally, it's still not 0. our high demand, like for quality of life, is driving the emission in the developing world for sure. Because if we buy stuff from there, their industry is going to produce pollution. It's going to emit a lot of carbon into the air. And then, so how can we help in this way? So, like, just not doing our daily duties, but also going beyond, because like we're not even talking about the past damages. It's like currently what our way of living is producing emissions in the developing world.
Does anyone know, like, what things would most be doing that? Does anyone?
What things would be most producing the emissions? I don't know that, but I was going to give an answer that was a typical economics answer to that question. Okay. And so I can go back to Sweden and we can go back to the Nordic countries where things are really, really, really expensive. And make whatever you buy really expensive. And people buy less of it. And then, so you could do that through a whole range of things. You could just do it by raising taxes, consumption taxes on everything, or especially on things that use, or one of my colleagues at Food and Resource Economics is working on a carbon content sort of a way to sort of start across the world coming up with these standards. Okay, this product seems to produce more carbon have more carbon in its production, which is sort of going back to the question you just asked. So there's a way to certify it and set up some certification agencies, and then when it comes to your border, tax the hell out of something that's really, really carbon intensive. And that's the best way to get people to consume less.
I'll just quickly add that it depends on the products, obviously, but often it's not what you consume, it's how it was produced. And that's particularly true with food. So if you wanted to reduce emissions that are generated by what you eat, it's more effective to eat lower on the food chain, like less red meat, than to buy locally. Because despite the emissions it takes to transport things around the world, it's a tiny fraction of what it does to produce the actual food itself.
Okay, thank you so much for that talk. It was really great. I have a question regarding mostly international investment kind of policies. So recently I'm back from Colombia, and in Colombia, a Canadian company bought out what used to be a public company that took care of all the energy providers in the country. And they have a lot of power over land that should be protected as national parks. So my question about that is a responsibility from the developed world or the developing world to set some rules on who can invest on this kind of land, and how much of a role should the developing world have, and how much of a role should developed countries have in not acting this way? Should there be any role at all? Thanks.
Anyone able to speak to that?
I have a general distaste for paternalism from the developed world, so that sort of feeds into my thoughts on this. It's just, you've got to let the developing world choose what's right for them and what's not. But I think it's good to hold your own countries, like Canada should hold their countries, firms that go invest abroad, to standards that are local. So if someone goes abroad and is damaging the environment and it's against the Canadian law, I think that should apply to a country that's registered, to a company that's registered in Canada and going abroad.
Just to add to that, I support that view in the sense that we've already all touched on the necessity of local solutions in emerging economies. So they're going to develop the types of solutions that they need. And the whole prescription approach that we've seen in the 70s in terms of structural adjustments and the World Bank kind of approach is changing. And I think there's much greater recognition. In fact, a great new initiative is the New Development Bank, which is basically the BRICS countries and the growth of the cities and the economies of the emerging economies.
So BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China?
That's right.
Yeah.
So this is an investment organization that's run by these countries to tailor, to capture that revenue stream and reinvest in those economies. So they're doing it for themselves, and that's what's needed. And so I think that's a great initiative, and we need more of that.
Are there any textbook examples of like a imposed solution that was really dumb? Like from outsiders saying we fix things this way that can help drive that point of paternalism being problematic home?
Provide some, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll briefly say, I don't want to get back to the same example a lot, but I mentioned that I work in this country, Kiribati. It's very low-lying, and 15 years ago, the World Bank set up a demonstration project there, and so it had been going for about 10 years. They're on the end of this phase 2, but most of it had been consultations, capacity building, but all things that you need to do, right? But then, getting on 10 years, and the government of the country, people had heard about the project, seen the sign on the side of the road, were getting antsy, saying like, I want to see something concrete, like what's real. And so they said, well, we need to really push projects. We need to build some seawalls to prove that we can do something. And so they went out and hired a new contractor, so a different firm from the consultants they'd had before. And the new contractor didn't look at all the previous consultations about what a good design was and everything. They just came up with something that they knew would work, that the local people would know how to build. And they paid, and they built these 4 seawalls. Each of them are 100 meters long or so, protecting like key assets. One of them's at the end of the airport runway. And just months later, they all had big, bad erosion problems at the ends of the seawalls. And I won't get into the physics of why, but the design wasn't great, right? And it was because they just forced a solution into the place that didn't really fit. So it's a failure, except that by failing, people have learned what's a better way to do it. And now they've repaired the walls, and things are changing. So the paternalism of that was terrible, except that if that hadn't happened, they maybe never would have learned how to do this better. And now it's happening. And the lesson from that to me is that this is just really expensive and hard to do. Yeah.
I think one of the things, too, to reflect back on is the billions of dollars that have been spent in aid, not related to climate change, and the lack of effectiveness of a large portion of that money in actually affecting change in a positive way. And I think we need to really reflect on that when we think about aiding countries in adapting to climate change and to reducing their emissions. How do we actually help other countries in a way that can actually be effective? And I think that there's a lot to be learned about what not to do with some of the ways that assistance has been given in the past.
Whether it's climate change or not. Was there another question in the audience?
I'd just like to know why it is so absolutely all right that we know that Canada will not fulfill what it promised in Paris. I find that very difficult to swallow. And I think as citizens, I'm outraged. I would like that my country promises what it can keep, or at least tries to keep. And I know that we're in a very difficult position because we have those dirty tar sands. And if we bring those to the shore and take them to China, we can no longer. We will increase our emissions much, much more. We still increase every year, and the whole world still increases. And I think it's time for a really radical change. And I think it has to come from the government. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Mr. Justin Trudeau can keep some of his promises. My question is, how can we make them keep those promises? It was promised in Paris.
How can we make even our own government keep its promise?
Speak up, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's.
Well, I speak up.
Yes, please do.
I also try
Yes.
to live accordingly. And by the way, I think biotechnology is a disaster.
Okay, that's, we'll move on. So I'm going to take, I think we're going to take it to the last question for you guys. Any closing thoughts that you want to leave our audience with before we continue the conversation up at the much storied top floor of this beautiful building? In particular, it doesn't have to be this, but is there something that does inspire you about what is actually a fairly depressing topic, I think, for some of us. What closing thoughts would you like to leave the audience with?
You know, I'm actually going to just close by saying that for all of the depressing sort of thoughts that come up with climate change, as somebody that works on this for a living and spends most of their time thinking about it, I'm not actually pessimistic about solutions to climate change, even though I don't think Canada will meet its targets. I think it's kind of unlikely. But I don't think it's impossible, and I think that really there is so much good news out there around the world. If you compare where we are now to where we were 3 years ago, right? China agreed to what year their emissions are going to peak. Afterwards, they'll start going down. That was not the case 5 years ago, right? 5 years ago, if I told you that solar panels could be close to cost competitive with many fossil fuel forms of energy, people would say I was crazy. But actually, that's the case, right? So much so that solar companies in the US are really struggling because suddenly they can't make as much money because it's cheaper to produce it. So there's just, these changes happen so rapidly that we shouldn't assume that it's impossible, but it is important still for people like us to point out, listen, Canada's nowhere close to meeting its targets, because we need to let people know that so that you can be outraged and you can complain to your government, right? And say, let's do as much as we can.
So I'd like to bring up a point in my closing comment of something that really relates to Canada, and it relates to developing countries. And I think that we have to realize that we have many communities here in Canada that are very remote communities, that are generally in the far north, that are subject to many of the same concerns and issues that the developing world is. They have energy poverty, they're living on diesel for their energy source. They have very low incomes. They're experiencing climate change through, for example, the permafrost melting, which is resulting in disruptions of their roads, of their buildings, of their livelihoods, of their food sources. So I think we have to not just think of the developing world that needs attention, but also we have many communities, not only here in Canada, but all developed countries around the world that also are facing some of the same issues that the developing world is. So by looking at how to assist our communities in addressing climate change, we can also help ourselves to think about how we can maybe best assist developing countries as well.
Right, Martino.
I can reflect back on how I got into this field of study, and the short answer is that I had a very short attention span, meaning that I liked science, I liked politics, I liked governance, I liked all of these different disciplines. And in some ways, that has carried me through in terms of just being curious. And the curiosity underlying, I think, curiosity is a great problem to work on. And this is what has always motivated science and technology. I think that although it is a tremendous challenge, it's also a tremendous opportunity. We just have an opportunity right now in history to really revolutionize the way that we live and the way that we think about how we interact with each other and the world. And so this is, I'm also quite optimistic. So all the trends that Simon laid out, I absolutely agree with. We would have never thought that 5-6 years ago. And yet the level of consciousness of these global issues is I believe, to be reaching a tipping point. So I have a lot of optimism, and it's a great time for inquisitive minds that are looking for tough challenges to work on, to get involved.
Okay, I'm going to fight my natural pessimism around this and try and give you guys a good story. But here's my story. I guess it's so one of the things I work on is trying to analyze policies in Canada and other parts of the world, encouraging adoption of energy efficient vehicles, so hybrids and electric cars. And we struggle. We've struggled in North America to get people to take up hybrid cars, to take up electric cars. And we've offered lots of money. We still are offering lots of money for them to take up electric cars. And I go to India and I see in Delhi people autonomously, the poor people who ride cycle rickshaws, and they earn like 40 rupees a day or 50 rupees a day. But they're going out and contracting with someone to buy an electric auto rickshaw. And the electric auto rickshaw takes 10 people, and they sort of serve as a feeder to the metro, to the big Delhi commuter metro, from the metro station to little outlying areas where the metro does not connect. And I see it mushrooming, and those electric autos are made in China, adapted in Delhi, using truck batteries, so they don't have good battery technology, but they make do with what they have, and they run.
And we could learn.
I guess what we learned there is, if it's expensive to have gasoline, to run your vehicle on gasoline, people will buy electric cars. We don't have to give them money for it.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about upstairs. I would like to thank our panelists. I truly believe that people who have a deep knowledge, like the four of you, and can share it with people who are not experts in your field, are a force for good in the world. So thank you for being up here, and thank you to UBC for hosting this event.